Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Lisa Melandri. I am Executive Director here at CAM. This is a program amongst a series of programs that we call Regarding, where we take work in exhibitions that are currently on view and sort of explode them into a series of conversations that can talk about current events, social justice, any manner of other kinds of information that intersect with those works. And I am particularly delighted to have you here tonight for this Regarding, which will kind of use as its base and its inspiration the work on view by Sanford Biggers. I want to introduce our wonderful moderator and really the woman who made this all happen for us, and then have her introduce our other stellar and wonderful speakers. We are so honored to have them here. And that is Rebecca Wanzo, who is Associate Professor in the Women, Genders, and Sexuality Studies program and Associate Director, Center for Humanities at Washington University. And I will let her take it away from here, but I thank you guys so much for being here. It's really a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So I was really grateful to Lisa and Wesson for inviting me to have this conversation. I hope everyone has had a chance to see Sanford's work, and that you'll take a chance to look if you haven't, maybe even during the panel or afterwards, because I think it offers a real opportunity to think about the challenges and the art of representing Black death, and also representing Black mourning. And I wanted to be on a panel with Nichole Bridges and Michael Gillespie because I think their disciplinary perspectives really help us think about the ways in which Biggers' work expands our understanding of the challenges and the art of this, and also speaks to larger questions about representations of Black death and Black mourning that I think people are dealing with in a variety of media. I saw Nichole a few years ago do a conversation with Nick Cave at SLAM, and I really marveled at her ability to frame a conversation and keep it on track when other people on the stage were so intent on making it about anything other than what she was saying. They were playing with her hair, they were dancing because he has puppets dance around her. Like, it was just, I was like, Nichole can do anything. But besides that performative skill set, I wanted to have a conversation with her because of her knowledge base as well. She's the Associate Curator for African Art and the Associate Curator in charge of overseeing the Department of Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas at St. Louis Art Museum. She joined the museum in 2013. She was the Associate Curator at the Newark Museum, as well as the head of the Department of the Arts of America, the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific Islands at the Baltimore Museum of Art. She holds undergraduate degrees in fine arts, art history, and French from Amherst College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and a master's degree and doctorate in art history from the University of Wisconsin. And Michael Gillespie is Associate Professor of Film at the City College of New York. I'm grateful for him picking up the phone when I said, hey, just come do a panel in the midst of his busy schedule. He's the author of the fantastic film Blackness, American Cinema, and the Idea of Black Film, published by Duke University Press. He's lectured widely on Black film and visual culture around the country. And this summer, he co-edited a series of Black one-shots for the Journal for the Association for Study of the Arts of the Present that featured many scholars producing short 1,000-word essays on contemporary Black art objects. If you haven't read any of them, it's open access, so I encourage you to take a look. So there's some really wonderful pieces. So I wanted Michael here.
Including Rebecca's.
But I wanted Michael here because he's been thinking about ideas of Black death and visual culture, and every time I see him, he shows me something new and teaches me something new. So I'm really just going to frame some historical questions before we get to the main event, which is what I understand Nichole and Michael's being. In some ways, it seems so obvious that it doesn't merit saying that grief often feels unrepresentable, and the specificity of losses to state violence are unrepresentable. But of course, we've both seen people killed, some of us in person, others only on media. Many artists and writers have tried to talk and represent grief, both specific ways and cultural ways. And it's the state violence that makes the mourning public. It's what makes it seem to belong to so many of us and not just to family and friends. Courtney Baker argues in her book Humane Insight that looking at Black death can participate both in the production of race and racism and the destruction of it. So one of the key questions is obviously, how do we know the difference? So with this panel, the hope is that we could pull together different perspectives to think broadly about the difference medium might make in Black visual mourning, and the question of best practices of creators and of witnessing to Black death from state violence, which transforms death from the familial and local to the public. So I just wanted to put up some prompts that perhaps my esteemed co-panelist or the audience might take up when we have a conversation. So the originary place to think about this issue is obviously lynching. An Equal Justice Initiative report in 2015 claimed that 3,959 Black people were lynched between 1877 and 1950. Obviously, there were people who were not Black who were lynched, but the majority of people who were lynched were African American. And it's larger than the Tuskegee study numbers, which have been reported for many years. I have here an NAACP poster from 1926, which, following the work of Ida B. Wells, a red record from 1896, does the vital work of reporting data about lynching and disabusing people of the perceptions about why African Americans were lynched, i.e. the idea that they were all rapists, when actually we know that Black success and encroachment on white spaces is the predominant thing that produced lynching violence. So one of the things about lynching is you have to find ways to address systems and scale. And scale is something I'd love for us to talk about, because scale is something that dehumanizes. Death on a large scale is ironically also a reduction. It reduces people to a number. It's too big to fathom. There's not really psychological space sometimes to mourn each individual. So masses can make people care less, right, rather than more, even as large numbers are essential to demonstrating the systemic nature of violence. So it's interesting to think about the visual representation of scale, what it can do, what it can't do. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which I have not seen yet, but I've read about and hope to go to in the next year, is about lynching, and it's about scale. And they choose not to represent the bodies, right, through photographs or realistic images, right, in the memorial. So I don't know if anyone in the audience has been. Has anyone been? Just curious. But I'm just interested in the aesthetic practice of representing scale. And I could have presented an image of lynching here, or multiple images. I chose not to. I haven't always made that choice when teaching or talking about lynching. One of the reasons is that I think it's important to witness, and many of my students haven't seen these representations. They don't know this history specifically. I think it's important, again, to bear witness, but lynching scholar Caretha Mitchell asks, what is it that you really know when you look at these? And there's a way that the photograph so often still focuses on the white people smiling around the dead body, so it still redirects your gaze to white people. So she always resists and refuses to reproduce these images. But what do you do with this importance of witnessing? And then there's the issue of the multiplicity of them. And when there's so many, what do you do with that? Which I think a lot of us have had that feeling with the unending number of representations of police brutality. On one hand, you feel like you need to witness it. On the other hand, there are so many. What do you do with the sheer scale of them? So there's a problem with the repetition of images, and there's scholarship from cognitive scientists and other people, just philosophers, ethicists, that say one of the problems is that it can desensitize you. So what do you do with that? So I want to think about the difference between witnessing and the ethical necessity of it, and the possible injuriousness of representing Black death. How do we feel after repetition of these images? Which brings me to Gemma Teal. His mother famously said, "Let people see what they did to my son." His face is grotesque here, unmade by the violence. It was really important for her to show it, though. And I think that one of the things that's interesting to think about is, what do we do with the ways in which mothers function as the mechanism for communicating state violence and injury, right? And it's as if we need multiple bodies to do it. So I'll talk about that a little bit in a second, but I think that there's something to think about in terms of the mother giving us permission to show and see what's happened to someone, right, when they're not here to say, I want to be seen. So what are the ethical practices of showing what's happened to the body, right? And I think that the BAM, that Sanford Biggers' work on BAM really speaks to that. And I also think that, but there's something about the idea, and here we see the image, the very famous image of him weeping over her coffin, his coffin, that we need 3 bodies sometimes to see or mourn Black male death, right? So the 3 images that are important with Gemma Teal are not just what happened to him after death and this horrible thing that was done to her son. It's also her weeping. And then there's the image of what he looked like before he was murdered, right? So it's like you need 3 bodies to mourn 1 body. And one of the reasons I think about that is that I, in my earlier work, did work on child murder and representations of child murder in the media. And there's this historian named Paula Fast who talks about child abduction and kidnapping, and she says, when we talk about kidnapping, which is one of the, and by strangers, which is one of the number one things that American parents are concerned about, despite the statistical anomalousness of it, it's only 3% of children that are kidnapped by strangers. It's a very small percent. Most people, if they're kidnapped or abducted, they're taken by people they know, often caregivers, other parents, other family members. If children get hurt, it's almost always people they know. But still, she said, it's the individual story. It's Charles Lindbergh's kid, it's Elizabeth Smart, it is John Benet Ramsey, and there's a way in which it's always about individual white children. You don't talk about slavery. You don't talk about Indian removal. You don't talk, she had one line in her book about the Atlanta child murders, right, where there were multiple people, multiple children missing and murdered. And there is something about sort of this complex story about one individual missing child that gets to be representative of everyone, even though there are other kinds of children who are at risk, that makes a child visible. So I do want to think about, again, this relationship of scale, but also the individual story. But part of Say Your Name, or saying people's names, is remembering individuals, even as we're trying to talk about structural violence. So, I went to the African American History Museum recently, and the Till Memorial contains the original coffin without his body. The satin has been replaced, but you're in the presence of the pictures, right, and the history. But the family asked that people don't take photographs, and probably because there's a concern about the ways in which it could be more of a tourist attraction than a memorial. And the slippage between those two things, which I think we can have a sense of, particularly in St. Louis, when we think about Canfield Drive, for example. It's one thing if you go on a march or even to put things on the memorial, but I often felt discomfort about the idea of just taking people to see it, right? So we have this question of how we have these sort of various things to think about. We've got scale, we've got the photograph and realist representations, memorial objects like the coffin, survivors as witnesses, as ways to think about who and how we represent Black mourning practices. So I'm just gonna end with a couple of images here. This is a slide from a graphic novel by Jeremy Love called Bayou, and I've thought about this image for the 10 years since I first saw it. And in this comic, Gollywog dolls are these monsters and are what happens to Black people who are destroyed by racialized violence and who can't let go of their bodies, and they can't let go of what happened to them. And I've been haunted by it because part of the whole story here is also that, they drag others under, right? And it's an image about the living and the dead, and what racialized violence does to us who are survivors, and the idea also that it could still be acting on the people who are lost. And so it also evokes this kind of the spiritual question, which is really important to Bam and Biggers' work, where he produces these figures as objects of power, and this idea that you can think about how these souls can be transformed after death. And with the Bam sculptures, if you haven't seen them, he sculpts them with bullets, and there's something horrific about that, right? So you're left with these sculptures, though, that are all unique and compelling and speaking through the specificity of the malformation, and that allows us to sit with the idea that maybe even within that destruction, something can be reborn. So those are the questions I just wanted to ask to frame it, so I'll turn to my co-panelists, first Nichole and then Michael.
Thanks, Rebecca, for including me on this panel, and thanks to Cam and Lisa and Wesson and Misa for inviting me to participate tonight. Okay, is it? I don't think that's my slide. Okay. First, I'm going to just share a little bit about my own personal response to the Bam sculptures. I am an Africanist art historian and curator, and so I do have a sort of understanding of the essential forms that he's using, and I had kind of a response to those that I'd like to share with you. And then I'll situate the Bam sculptures into a longer history of memory and power objects by historical African artists. As an Africanist art historian working primarily with historic traditions-based arts, I couldn't help but to recognize and try to identify those forms when I first encountered them in the gallery. So automatically, my brain, my nerd African art brain says, oh, okay, I see a maternity figure in the style of Sanufo art from Côte d'Ivoire. I see a female mask in the style of Punu masks from Gabon. And I see a figure here with hands raised in the style of Dogon or Telem sculptures from Mali. But beyond that, I really surprised myself because I didn't find it particularly useful to try to ruminate further on possible layers of meaning that might be specific to how the historic forms served in their original context. It really wasn't that interesting to me. Nothing, I didn't really gain anything from it, so you're not missing anything. And this really attests to the power of the works themselves on their own terms. And Biggers himself has said that although he is knowledgeable about the cultural origins of the sculptures he uses, the specifics for him are not the point. So, yes. That said, I do see an essential connection between the Bam sculptures and the African object's original context of meaning, and that link is in the idea of ancestors. Historical traditions-based arts from Africa were created to honor and foster ongoing relationships between the living, us, and the ancestors. The Bam sculptures here draw us closer to the memories of Sandra Bland, Terence Crutcher, and Jordan Edwards, transforming them from victims of police violence into ancestral agents. The artist has referred to the Bam sculptures as both memory objects and power objects, and these are genres that have rich histories in art from Africa. As memory objects, the Bam sculptures fit into a long history of memorialization of Black traumatic experience by African artists. 19th century carved ivories made by Congo-Vili artists on the Luango coast of West Central Africa demonstrate portrayals of slave trade activity consistently throughout the corpus. Although created for sale as souvenirs to foreigners, the Luango ivories nonetheless were also souvenirs or memory objects for their Congo makers, documenting Congo perspectives of the complicated social dynamics at play in this contact zone. And here I'm showing you an example of one of these ivories. Again, it's from a body of, there must be 600 to 1,000 of them in collections throughout North America and Europe. And what you're seeing here are very graphic, vivid portrayals of the violence inherent to the slave trade, and some of the very emotive responses of the captive Africans there in yokes and chains, some being handled very aggressively by European handlers and also African middlemen and agents. The last documented ship holding captive, and this is just to orient us geographically, this is the Luango Coast region, which is on the Atlantic coast, around sort of north and south around the mouth of the Congo River on the Atlantic coast. So the last documented ship holding captive Africans departed from the Luango coast in 1868. Yet depictions of slave trade and related violence extends throughout the corpus of these ivories well through the 1910s. While it is possible that these images may have documented continued illicit trade in captive Africans, or, as one scholar has recently argued, respond to the popularity of David Livingstone's 1865 publication describing his accounts of East African slave trade, I argue that the persistence of these images stresses how deeply inscribed the traumas of slave trade and colonial violence were upon Congo collective memory and experience. These scenes, set in the broader context of Luango Ivory's discontinuous narrative, corresponds to the disruptions and elasticity that are inherent to memory itself. The insistent, persistent appearance of slaving imagery on Luango ivories, regardless of historicity, reveals the subject to be an undeniable lieu de mémoire. And I'm borrowing here from the French historian Pierre Nora. Lieu de mémoire, or sites of memory, are moments or places around which, quote, memory crystallizes and secretes itself, end quote, connecting the past with the present. In the BAM sculptures, Biggers has made lieu de mémoire of specific victims of police violence. Like Congo artists and the traumatic legacies of slave trade, Biggers has chosen specific instances of police violence against Black bodies as crucial sites of memory. And by making each BAM work specific to individual instances of violence, Biggers transforms the memories of each named victim into power objects. And as power objects, the BAM sculptures fit into a rich tradition of efficacious objects in historical and traditions-based African art. And I'm just showing you a few images. The three objects on the left are power objects in our collection at the St. Louis Art Museum. And on the right is a genre that I wish we had at SLAM, but a very beautiful example of a Bowley sculpture that's in the Met's collection. In African art history, we use the term power object or power figure to refer to objects that were implements of ritual specialists or initiated societies who activated otherwise inert sculptures through the application and accumulation of spiritually potent materials. So on the far left, the Congo nail figure was activated and made effective by the addition of these nails and blades that would call into action the resolution for a particular client's needs. And within the mirror, the box also held a medicinal, powerful matter. And the other figures as well are the sort of result from accumulated matter prescribed and applied by the ritual specialists. So these power objects can also be considered collaborative arts. They require a sculptor to provide the figure, the specialist to endow the object with medicines, and the client to receive healing and resolution that is facilitated by the power object and by the specialist. BAM sculptures also consist of accumulated matter, first wood, then wax, then the shooting by the bullets, which Biggers considers to be regenerative rather than destructive. And so they are powerful through that accumulated matter. As Biggers starts with prefabricated African sculptures, and he might ask an assistant to do the shooting. Again, the BAM sculptures are also collaborative. But I think that the BAM sculptures are not just receivers of veneration. As power objects, they are effective presences, empowered by their accumulative and regenerative matter. In a way, the BAM sculptures are kind of like an inverse of the historic African power figures. Perhaps action is not required of the BAM sculptures, but aided by the ancestral presence of Sandra, Terrence, and Jordan, the action is required of us. Thank you.
So I'm going to set it up. Can you start at the beginning? I'm going to talk for a little bit and then you can start. Does that sound cool? Hello. Thank you for the invitation to come and share some of my thoughts about this ever-pressing question and proposition. So one of the things that I've been working on a great deal in the last few years is conceptually this idea of cinema in the wake. And it is most immediately, of course, about thinking through the work of Christina Sharp. So one of the things that I'd like to do tonight is to talk a little, give you kind of a very brief summation of this ongoing engagement I'm having with Christina Sharp's work, and then screen what has been a very consequential object for me in terms of my thinking. Okay. So I'd like to begin with a quote from Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being. Quote, I'm interested in ways of seeing and imagining responses to terror in the varied and various ways that our Black lives are lived under occupation, ways that attest to the modalities of Black life lived in, as, under, and despite Black death, end quote. Christina Sharp's conception of wake work concentrates on how visual and expressive culture renders and contemplates death and the afterlife of slavery and Black life. Her assessment of existence in the wake attends to the structural and the affective with reference to a range of connotations, including keeping watch with the dead, the path of a ship, a consequence of something, and the line of flight and or sight, awakening and consciousness. She mobilizes new investments for the study of Black death, and my particular interest in the larger question of the art of Blackness, or art of Black visual and expressive culture, with particular attention to how the arts unmediate this unsurvival. Mediation in the place of strict notions of art as an embodiment of experience has become a key tactic of my disquisitions on death in contemporary Black film and video. Sharp's work vitally suggests a shift of emphasis from merely the portrayal of horror to a concentration on how cinema enacts a critical and aesthetic resistance to the horror of anti-Blackness. Okay? So one of the pieces that was quite important for me in terms of what's in the gallery is the Infinite Tabernacle piece. All right, of course, if you've had a chance to observe it, this is the piece where the monitors are set and kind of are set vertical, giving this sense of a kind of digital tombstone. And within these digital tombstones, you have this interesting, the destruction or what I'm thinking of in terms of a kind of reanimation of these BAM figures that have run throughout Biggers' work. So I'd like to, in terms of a pivot from thinking of these issues of animatedness, I'd like to show you a piece called Dead Nigga Boulevard. It is a piece by Lela Weaver. If you forgive me from reading from my phone for a second. So one of the things that I find really fascinating about it, so following the grand jury decision to not indict Daniel Petelio in December of 2014 for the murder of Eric Garner, Smackmelon Gallery in Brooklyn, New York, postponed a planned exhibition and put out a call for work that responded to, quote, the continued failure of the United States to protect its black citizens from police discrimination and violence, end quote. Much of the work gathered from this call became the Respond Show, a show which ran from January to February of 2015. It was there that I first saw Lela Weaver's Dead Nigga Boulevard, which was made during Weaver's first year of MFA matriculation at Mills College. And for me, it became an important part of understanding this show, but also of understanding what has become a growing project for me. So this is Dead Nigga Boulevard.
Things are never as they seem. And when the reality of the direction you're traveling is realized, it is too late to turn around. How did we get here? What were the subtle signs that appeared when we weren't paying attention? How did we end up existing in this state of nothingness? We certainly didn't ask to be here, yet here we are. We are victims of blindness. This blindness still plaguing the people who walk the very soil where our bodies were left. We are left wondering, what happens now? There is a moment before your senses of the external world dissolve, and you can feel, touch, see, and taste the end. Well, in our case, we never reached that end. Instead, our souls have been left to float, scrape, and drag in despair. On Dead Nigga Boulevard, the sum of our existence is almost irretrievable, for it has sunken into the deepest parts of our wounds. Here, we exist in an afterlife that exceeds the expectations of hell in all its misery. Hell is saved for those who've lived morally bankrupt lives unapologetically. We, however, did nothing to deserve a punishment as such. To think the pigment of our complexions, a myriad they are, would determine which end of a weapon we'd end up on. Living life behind society's veil of blackness is a paradox. The veil decides for us that we are seen as the killers instead of the killed. And that is what put our lives on the receiving end of hate, crimes, violence.
Okay. So I'd like to begin with a quote from the filmmaker Lela Weaver. Quote, "These representations are mediated by screens, filtered through estranged voices, and processed by infinite amounts of digital data. I grappled with how to communicate the ways in which Black bodies are constantly confronted with and negotiating the liminal space between life and death. I wanted to build this fictional place as though it existed. But like heaven and hell, it had no specific location or associations to a tangible geography. The characters inhabit and function within the space of necrosis, which the natural staccato of stop motion lends itself to," end quote. From above, a puppet is lowered into the frame by a string and placed among a sparse set of model buildings, bottles, and debris strewn on a fabricated ground, and of course nooses hanging from artificial trees. 3 cycles and 3 puppets arrive. One of the puppets wears a dress shirt, slacks, and a fedora. Another is in a gray hoodie with jeans. The third sports a black knit cap with a black hoodie and jeans. These puppets are not anonymous or unknown objects. Each bears a distinct iconic image as its face: Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin, and Oscar Grant. These photograph-faced objects produce an eternal return of the look. Their eyes are the arrested apertures of 3 absented souls, all figured as threat, judged disposable, and framed ineligible for empathy or protection. Shot in black and white, Lela Weaver's Dead Nigga Boulevard centers on these 3 solemn puppets: selective grace, 3 for all the world to see. Constituted by phantasmagoric force through stop-motion animation, the puppets are performing objects posed as moving pictures incarnate. Those that were terminally disarticulated become articulated figures in motion as form dissuades the stilling of death, demonstrating that, quote, "The dynamic between motion and stillness is the dynamic between life and death. That is nowhere more dramatically captured than in stop-motion animation," end quote. Furthermore, there's the inspiration of Jan Falkmeyer's early animation practice that rouses Weaver's own fabulation of a contemporary hauntology review. Not the stumble or stutter of the improperly buried, nor the undead, these moving figures echo a point about animatedness, and the ways of the subjected freedom form exhibited by these puppets occurs as the conjuring of black matter, a summoning of death's active remnants. Throughout the film, its voiceover operates less as an omniscient and abstracted narrator than a voice of deliberation and dispute. It operates also with a slippage or equal division between omniscience and interior monologue of its embodied figures. The voiceover cycles not as instruction or cheer, but rather deadpan introduction. The face of the Emmett Till puppet is the photograph of a sharply dressed and smiling boy from Christmas 1957, an image that once was half of a crushing dyad, meant to compel a recognition of and empathy for the life of an ordinary boy, someone's son, someone who was loved. Trayvon Martin's photograph is a hooded selfie, his casual self-portraiture and self-valuation that retroactively circulated as veneration and foreshadowing. The Oscar Grant puppet shows him smiling with a baby in his lap. And just a curious note about that photograph. I mean, are you all familiar with that Oscar Grant photograph of him smiling? If you go online at any moment and you type in Oscar Grant's name, you will often get this picture that is the face of the puppet, which is him with his knit cap on. But what I've always found fascinating about that picture is that in the lower left-hand corner, the way that the photograph has always been cropped, you can never remove the presence of the child that he's holding in his hand, right? So the question I had was, who is this child? I think there's been a general assumption that it's his daughter. But what I ended up doing at one point was calling all the major newspapers in San Francisco and getting connected to the photography departments, and it still remains a mystery. No one can identify this child. So the photograph provided by his family and later cropped and circulated often features a portion of the baby's head in its lower left-hand corner, a cropping that connotes a grievous shearing, a demarcation of his loss of a place among the living. All three photographs resonate with the solicitation of I am, framed to attest to a life and injustice. They are Black boys and men executed by institutional as well as freelance social contract killers. These iconic photographs, coupled with their moving puppet vessels, are generatively imbricated and propelled by historiographies devoted to the mobilizing of bodies and provocations of resistance. Each of these photographs, repurposed as a puppet's face, conveys a distinct visual frequency of memory and grievability, a distinct irreconcilability. It is this indexical sentience of the photographs that is compounded and escalated by Weaver's formal scripting of post-mortem comprehension, if not eternal distress. In three recurring sequences, each puppet individually approaches a monitor on the wall of one of the set's model buildings that then projects the circumstances of their respective arrivals in this place. This is your life, this is your death. Teal's monitor features a close-up of his Christmas photo, a coffin carried by pallbearers, and the photo of a boy destroyed and a body that a mother would not let be hushed away by lie and lies. The Martin's Figures monitor features the surveillance footage of him purchasing Skittles and an Arizona iced tea before walking home and meeting his end. He wears a hoodie and thus invites any and all lethal profiling scenarios. For the Grant figure, the monitor plays the cell phone footage of his murder at Fruitvale Station. The viral circulation of the Grant video occurred, as is the case in many other instances of digital recordings of unnamed African Americans being murdered by police, in the hope that the site of the act itself might be an evidentiary truth that would guarantee justice. The collective narratives of the trio demonstrate the everyday and systemic horrors visited upon Black life, not by the fates or others versed in the craft of strings and destiny, but by random arbiters and executioners. The three puppets exhibit sadness, console each other, stir with chatter, and bond as a fellowship of the Black dead. Their gathering suggests that the Black dead require more than coins on their eyelids to find peace or justice on the other side. The Black dead can cross with the aid of those who have gone before, those stolen away, as Claudia Rankine explains, quote, because white men can't police their imaginations, Black men are dying, end quote. In her closing comments on American anti-Blackness and its rendering in Black visual and expressive culture, Elizabeth Alexander asks, what do people do with their history of horror? What does it mean to bear witness in the act of watching a retelling? What does it mean to carry cultural memory in the flesh? Dead Nigga Boulevard offers an additional proposition. What does it mean for the dead to bear witness to their own deaths? Before the start of the credit sequence of the film's closing, a note appears. When will it end? The puppet animation of the film, its exercise in Black object life, suggests an answer to this question through recognizing that what distinguishes a puppet from a person, a thing from a subject, is a matter of power and not just interpretation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for those comments, and we start a little late, and I want to open it up for questions. I'll just note that one of the things that seems to unite your comments is this idea of animation, that there's a way in which the African sculptures, the power objects, and just even the idea of going to the continent as a way to sort of think through these issues, is it reanimates their bodies or regenerates them, and then how animation works in this film, because I'm really struck by the ways in which I was thinking of Kara James Marshall, Rhythm Master, which combined Japanese Bunraku puppetry with African sculpture in a story that was about racialized violence in the city. And it is this way in which returning to the continent is so often, so many African American cultural contexts understood as the only way to heal, right?
Well, that's what Black Panther wanted us to believe.
Are you going to slam Black Panther this evening,
All right,
Michael? Or do we have to go there?
It's another conversation.
It is
sorry.
another conversation. But I do think I'm interested in this idea of the mediation, like on one hand that it's, when you said that part of what the arts do, so they unmediate, right? So I mean, this question of whether or not this work brings us closer or then brings us further away because we're so unsettled, right? So how both of those things are happening at the same time. But is there any comments or questions? Because we could keep talking, but, or I could ask some more questions. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. First and foremost, I want to say thank you. I'm extremely thankful for the opportunity that you all provided to have this conversation and create this space. And what I was pretty much struggling with during the conversation was whenever we typically talk about Black death, we talk a lot about murders and homicides and police brutality, but I'm really interested in how we can illustrate some type of structural or state violence which isn't always direct, such as environmental violence or death caused by disease or death caused by illness, that are still both structural and institutional, but aren't often depicted within history or within the literature, within art.
Which we might call slow death, right?
Right.
Do you want to comment? I can comment. Okay. Thanks for that. I mean, and I suppose I want to speak most immediately to this issue of environmental racism. The New York Times did a profile piece on a scientist by the name of Neri Oxman, who works at MIT in the material ecology lab. And one of the things that she ended up talking about was how, and it was kind of a jokey comment, but it was also quite terrifying, was this notion that melanin is gold, and that as we deal with more of the consequential effects of climate change and the deterioration of the ozone layer, that there will be an incredibly lucrative market in the manufacturing of melanin, which for me, I would highly recommend that you take a look at a film by a woman, A. Saida Clarke, and the film is called White. And I don't want to spoil too much about this film, but it definitely deals with these questions of what happens in the future as we deal with more of these consequential environmental changes when Black and brown people just become another available resource. I think there's other kinds of work like this that's being done. Terrence Nance did a film called They Charge for the Sun, and there are a few others as well that I think are of course, either working within this brand of speculative fiction or Afrofuturist or just straight up science fiction of exploring these issues. But it's I think that the ways in which we might have most immediately talked about Black Death is here today or tonight is a part of a much larger conversation that all kinds of art's being made on that. Yeah.
Yes.
A. Saida Clarke. It's Clarke with an E, and it was a part of the kind of an online Twilight Zone series that PBS had put together called Future States. Barry Jenkins did a great one called Remigration, kind of it acts as kind of a coda to Medicine for Melancholy and kind of dealing with issues of gentrification in that same kind of environmental vein.
And I feel like I've seen a piece I'm blocking. He did something on Flint. Someone who did something on.
Right.
There's some piece.
There's a recent piece. I saw it at Black Star in Philly, which looks at a future in Los Angeles where everything it's class-based in terms of your access to water, and it's directly inspired by Flint, and it's a brother who's coming out of the AFI. So I think the film is going to be released online at the start of next year. Yeah.
Questions? Paige?
Thank you so much for this panel and for your comments. Nichole, as you were speaking about the power objects and Biggers' own making of the power objects, implicitly you place him as a kind of leader of a ritual, right, who's investing these objects with a certain kind of commemorative power. And I think hearing him talk about it, that he might see it that way as well, but at the same time, we're also asked to bear witness to his terrible abuse of these objects, right? There's the hot wax, there's being shot with the gun, the bronzing. So, I mean, I'm just really interested if anybody on the panel has thoughts about that tension, because there's a kind of reenactment of the violence, right, that's taking place as he makes the work, at the same time that they're being established as these powerful commemorative power objects. So I don't know if anybody has thoughts about that.
Yeah, actually, that was at one point I had something like, is Sanford Biggers the ritual specialist here, in one of my drafts. I think that just hearing Sanford Biggers speak about the shooting of the works really transformed my thinking as well of that act, where he really says it's not destructive, it's regenerative, and so it really turned that in my head, and I just thought, okay, well, in the history of African art, lost wax casting and bronze is one of the most advanced skill sets, and celebrated in African art history, dating back to the 12th century. So, covering the wood in wax and then covering with bronze is sort of akin to that process in my mind. And so I'm sort of putting them into this canon of historical African art works that are, important works and powerful works in and of their own right. So, but the destructive nature is important because, of course, he's honoring these individuals who have been transformed into ancestors as a result of destructive actions, and so that is very pertinent as well. But I don't.
And I wonder, but there is something about, with sort of the objects that pick up things that sort of make them, right, the sort of the transformative piece that, so you have the African objects and African sculptures, but the only thing that's thoroughly American other than the memory of the person who has been lost is the bullet. Like there's something, there's something kind of, what's the word for it? It's this indictment that the Americanness, it's the bullet is what you carry. They carry with them. It's not other kinds of African American Black cultural objects that are sort of transformed. So there's something that's, I think, resistant as well as regenerative and sacred about this sort of new form after that. But yeah. Any other questions or comments? Okay.
I don't want to take up too much space. I didn't introduce myself last time. I'm Nigel Walden. I'm actually a previous student at WashU. And the next question is the last one that I have is in response to her question, because when looking at art that is supposed to meant to memorialize life and living, how do you all decipher your interpretation of the pain or the destruction of the death and the experience of the living and the memorialism of the life that was prior to the death and mortality.
So you could say again, how do you decipher what?
What you interpret within the art between the death and mortality of the dead and the memorialism of the living.
I can kind of speak to that. I can tell you about what my process usually is. If I'm looking at a work of art and it feels static in the sense that it is posing some kind of question and then immediately providing some kind of answer, then I'm usually deeply disinterested. What makes me inspired and excited about art is that art which is deliberately kind of irreconcilable. I appreciate work which inhabits this space where it has this kind of affective resonance which kind of raises my responsibility, not only as a reader of the work, but as someone who appreciates art, that I have to do a bit of work and thinking and processing of my own kind of subject position. But I appreciate work which has a kind of haunting quality to it, and pushes me in ways where I think it has to do with my general skepticism about work that insists on answers. Because when I walk through Sanford's and I see Sanford's work, I think it's the work. It pushes me to do more work than strictly sitting back and treating it like a puzzle per se. You know? But that's what works for me.
Okay. No. I mean, I would just add that the prompt that I started with is, again, the unrepresentability of the impossibility. There is, I think, always an impossibility that's in some way signified by this collapse of time between Gemma Teal in conversation with Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown and Oscar Grant, that the fantasticness and horribleness of the fact that we are constantly dealing with state violence and other state violence writ broadly, right? And that, you know, how are we supposed to feel in relationship to the repetition of it, and how can you possibly capture the excesses of it, right? And so part of what I'm just always so interested in following Michael is the artist like sincere attempts to take on, again, the impossibility of really capturing how hard it is to actually really get at what the experience is of living in the wake of state terror against Black bodies. But so maybe we'll end there. But was there another question? Okay, yes. Okay, sorry, Raisa.
We have a brave soul back there. Yeah. No.
Well, again, thank you so much for your discussion. And I have a couple of comments that I thought of when I was hearing everyone speak. And so the first is thinking about Rebecca's comment about needing 3 bodies in the photograph to represent the one body that's lost. And I was reading an essay by Eula Biss, who's a nonfiction writer and essayist, and she was saying, the essay she wrote was about white guilt and debt. And I'm kind of forgetting how she made this connection to thinking about her own white guilt in relationship to state violence against Black bodies. And so one of the things she was talking about, I forget who was the Black man who was murdered at the time, right? I'm forgetting who it was. But she was saying, I didn't want to look at the video, but I remember Mamie Till Mobley saying for people to look at her son, and so therefore I looked at this video. And it struck me because I'm thinking, wait, Mamie Till Mobley said that about her son. That doesn't mean that for this current man, why, you know, like this injunction to look, and how Mamie Till Mobley's injunction becomes this way of thinking about this access we have to look at all Black bodies and Black death. And then the other comment comes from the video of Dead Nigga Boulevard, and particularly thinking about the fact that in the relationship between these three men who stand in for the mass of black people, particularly of black people, and particularly how we get figured as black men who are dying at the hands of state violence. And so, and I think what stood out to me most was that of the puppets looking back at the surveillance camera from the moments just before their death, right? Or the photograph, because for Emmett Till, we don't have the medium of him, like a recorded video, but we have his funeral, right? And so thinking about the iconography of these figures and how can we have them represent Black death without, I guess, our ability to have seen and being able to witness the moments leading up to or the moments directly after, right? So kind of the thousands of Black people who are dying at the hands of police, but whose story we don't get to know, right? Whose death remains localized, and who don't get the mediatization, right, of these other figures. And so those are just more comments more than anything. But thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for your comments. I mean, when you said that it was hard to remember which particular video was circulating, I mean, that I can't watch the videos. And I can't watch the videos in the same way that, I mean, I talk to my students about this a lot, about, just the basic question of why do you watch these videos? I mean, I'm not trying to judge you, just tell me what your expectation is out of the video. And it always goes back to this notion that, again, that the videos will be evidentiary truth and they'll guarantee justice. And it usually leads to a Rodney King videotape story. And then it just leads to the history of lynching photographs. And just, what happens when you understand the image won't save you? Yeah. What happens when you understand that the image doesn't guarantee justice? That doesn't mean that I don't believe in justice. It just means that perhaps the conversation needs to be less invested in a kind of virality around these videos. That maybe that's not the most efficient means for us to, I mean, it takes a lot of psychic energy to look at this shit. It really, really does. And I think maybe that energy needs to be put someplace else.
It does sort of feel like this kind of group psychosis that we keep watching it. We're like, no, now people will see it, and this time,
it's like they saw it on the damn auction block.
It's been seen over and over again, and there's never justice.
They've seen it for 300, 400 years. What is different now?
And I should say this, my colleague Bryce Williams, who's working on a book about Black maternal grief as an analytic and way to sort of understand sort of these histories. And what I like about one of the things that was useful too about your comments, many things, but this question of who gives us permission to look, right? Like that is something that the mothers, like, so she said, you can look at my son Emmett, right? But, and then people record, but it's, I remember there was one video, the film where someone had killed someone or he videotaped it. It's like, sometimes people say, like, watch it because you are witnessing it. But I do always ask myself, would I want someone to watch my death over and over? There is this sort of, and there is a way in which art, in terms of the unmediation, to provide a distance that doesn't seem sometimes as much of a violation. Like, what are things that are violations and what aren't? And then there was the Emmett Till painting controversy last year, right? But that's another conversation. I mean, I do think, that the things like who owns, like this idea that we sort of own these deaths culturally, particularly when there's state violence, is really transparent. That makes it belong to all of us, but does it? Yeah. I don't know.
And also, no, you go.
I was really taken, Michael, by your sort of very poignant kind of plea of what's different from the auction block to these images today. What's different? Why do we expect it to be different? And there is something very poignant to it, which I think is in some ways an ongoing belief, faith that many Black Americans have in in sort of liberalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
That once liberalism perfects itself, as Rebecca would say, our suffering and will finally be legible to people, right? And of course, not all African Americans believe in that. Many African Americans are cynical and say no. But I think there's something that there is this sort of ongoing faith that, we hadn't really fully embraced liberalism during the slave era, obviously, we weren't following it, but there's somehow the sense that if once liberalism finally comes to perfection in the United States, our grief and our suffering will be legible. And I think that in some ways is the poignancy for many Black Americans, or the poignancy of Black America, and that connection to when will Black death be legible beyond our community.
I mean, and that also, thank you for that. I mean, that also kind of steps in, there's a larger horror at play, right? Because this idea that if people see the video, that they will have a moment of enlightenment and that there will be a guarantee of justice. So it's almost as though anti-Black violence and anti-Black racism is a condition of ignorance. It's exceptional. Yeah, that once someone is educated, then it'll stop. But the bigger horror is that when you look into someone's eyes and you see a sign of recognition, and then they look away.
It's what a lot of people, it's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
Any other comments, questions? Yes.
When you were, I guess one of the things that happened was when I was watching the video, it really, I don't know, that really kind of blew my mind in the way that it was being shown, but also when you were just talking about the comments from the director about this place of, I guess this in-between place of life and death.
Right.
And I began to really start thinking about that in the sense of, I guess, because when we're seeing these things, whether by internet or through conversation, it feels like it could have easily been us, or it could have easily been somebody else. So like, I guess I really started thinking of, well, do we live in a place of constant between life and death where we are basically not unknowing of when that might actually be us, or could be us, or could be someone close to us. And also, I kind of really started thinking of a space between life and death where law and reality have no say, and space and time is also shifted as well. Because when you think about it, the different accounts of what somebody says happen, or the different, I guess, how different media sources begin to speak on these different things, and even how we begin to speak of them over time differently than maybe we have been spoken on them on the day that it happened. So yeah, those were just some of my comments and just some of my thoughts about, what does it mean for me even when I walk out of this space, of that weight of, am I really living within this space? Am I recognized, or am I just another person, number, whatever you want to call it, in this life?
Yeah. Thanks for your comments.
Yes.
Hi, I just have a question for the panelists, because this is kind of derived from both the showing of Dead Nigga Boulevard in relation to Biggers' choice of the bullet, because I kind of want to go back to that as his use in modifying the sculptures. And so one of the things that struck me most from Dead Nigga Boulevard is the choice at the end to go over each of the narratives and almost kind of qualify them as to speak to who these people were outside the context of their murders. They'll say this person was, 14, 17 years old. This person was from Chicago as opposed to being from the South and didn't understand the context, and that's why, this occurred. And one of the critiques that I've often seen of this kind of qualification is, again, this need to incessantly qualify why these people shouldn't be murdered other than the fact that they were people. And so I'm wondering, what do you think is the implication of Biggers' choice to use the bullet then as one of the most succinct components of commemorating these figures? as opposed to using other aspects of their life? Like, is there an implication that's different from using just the point of death as opposed to something else in their life?
Do you have your other draft open? Do you have that other draft?
I mean, I do think, in terms of what I said before, there is something about the regeneration or reclaiming or remaking that is the blending of the American object, which is the bullet, with the African figure, right? And it's an indictment of this construction of what's making Black subjects, and to me, I mean, there's definitely the possibility that someone can rise again in relationship despite the violence that's afflicting it, but there's something really obviously nastily critical, it seems to me, of the U.S. and the centrality of the gun and bullets and violence and sort of how it's aligned with, in all kinds of ways, Black male subjects. But
he's really appropriating the bullet, right? And he's repurposing it to activate the objects and to transform the memories of these individuals into sort of activated presences. So that's how I like to think about the bullet, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Any other thoughts? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming.